everybody, and welcome to the video for task 16.1. The learning target for today's video is going to be that we want to use geometric vocabulary to identify features of circles. So we're going to be looking at some pictures of circles today and some different geometric features that are inside of a circle, and we're going to be practicing naming them and identifying them using the right symbols and the right vocabulary. Before we do that, let's start with a quick review of some vocabulary from earlier this year. So the first vocabulary word I want to review with you is the word segment. A segment is going to be a piece of a line with two endpoints. An example of a picture of a segment would look like this. It actually stops, one on the left and one on the right. And we are always going to name a segment using those two endpoints. So I'm going to give them some letters, A and V. Now I could name this segment two ways. I could name it AV and draw a little picture of a segment on the top, or I could name it VA and draw a little picture of a segment on the top. Either way, that's how you name a segment. You use the two endpoints and put a little picture of a segment on the top. The second vocabulary word I want to review with you is the word line. A line goes on forever in both directions. It has no endpoints. It just keeps going. So an example of the way a line would look is very similar to a segment, but instead of having dots and points at the end, endpoints, it's going to have arrows at the end. It tells you it keeps going forever. Now, in order to name a line, we still need to know two of the points on that line. If there's more than 2 points, you would just pick your favorite 2 points to use to write the name. And I would name it using those 2 points. So I could name this segment AV and draw a little line on the top. You'll notice it has 2 little arrows, just like the picture. Or I could name it VA and draw a little line on the top. Again, you'll notice it has 2 little arrows, just like the picture. Now we're going to be using circle vocabulary and identifying different types of segments and lines that are related to circles. So let's learn some new vocabulary that we're going to use in this unit. The first new vocabulary word that we're going to use in this unit is the word chord. A chord is going to be a segment where the endpoints are both on the circle. So an example of a chord would look like this. It's a segment, so it has 2 endpoints, and both of those endpoints are actually on the edge of the circle. Now, I'm going to give those 2 endpoints names, and when I name this chord, I would use those 2 endpoints to name it. So I would name it either AV, or I could name it VA. Now, a diameter is what I like to think of as a special chord. You've probably heard the word diameter at some point before in your life. A diameter is a chord that passes through the center of the circle. It's going to be the longest chord that we can draw. An example of a diameter would look like this, where it goes right through the center of the circle. Again, when we name a diameter, we use the naming convention for a segment because it does stop in 2 places. So an example would be AV, or we could name this VA. Now, a radius is going to still be a segment, but it's a different type of segment. A radius is going to be a segment where one of the endpoints is on the circle, so on the edge, and the other is on the center of the circle, so on the middle. You've probably heard the word radius before. So a radius goes from the center to the edge of the circle. Since it's still a segment, we would still name it by using the 2 endpoint letters and drawing a little segment bar on the top, or we could name it VA. Now, in addition to looking at some special segments that are related to circles, we're also going to look at special lines. So the next 2 things that we're going to identify, features we're going to identify, are lines. A secant line is a line that cuts through the circle. It just slices right through there. Now that means it's going to touch the circle, the edge of the circle, in 2 spots. When we name a secant line, because it's a line, we would use 2 of the points on the line, and then over the top, we draw a little tiny picture of a line, which means it has 2 arrows on it. Another way to name that line would be VA. And again, my little symbol has 2 arrows at the top because it's a line and not a segment. The last feature of a circle that you're going to need to identify is what's called a tangent line. This is going to be a line that brushes against the circle. So an example of a tangent line would look like this. You'll notice that it just brushes the edge of the circle. If you zoom in really close, it only touches in one spot. Now, in order to name this line, we would still need to know two of the points on the line. So we would name this either AV and then put two arrows on the top, or VA and put two arrows on the top. Here's what we're going to be practicing when I see you again. I'm going to be giving you a picture and saying, name these features. So the first thing I might ask you to name is a chord. A chord should be a segment that starts and stops on the circle. So an example of a chord would be right here. It's AB. If I wanted to name that, since it's a segment, I would name it either AB with a little segment symbol on the top, or BA with a little segment symbol on the top. The second thing that I might ask you to identify is a secant line. Now, a secant line cuts through a circle. So the secant line in this picture would be right here. It cuts right through the circle and it keeps on going. I would name this secant line HJ and then draw a little line with arrows on the top, or I could name it JH and draw a little line with arrows on the top. Another feature of a circle I might ask you to identify is a tangent line. Now, a tangent line should brush against the circle. An example of a tangent line would be right here. Now, in this picture, we know three of the points that are on this line. You can pick any two of those points you want to make the name. I'm going to choose G and K. So I would name this line GK and draw a little line on the top. I could also call this line KF. I could call this line GF. Or I could even just take those names and reverse each of them and get three more options for naming. You have to pick one of these ways. And the way that you decide is you literally just pick any two letters you like the best and draw a little line on the top. Another thing I could ask you to identify is a diameter. Now, a diameter should be a chord. It should stop and start on the edge of the circle, but it should go through the middle. And in this picture, the diameter would be right here. Since we want it to go all the way from D and stop at E, we would name this diameter DE with a little segment on the top, or ED with a little segment on the top. Next, we have to name a radius. Now, a radius should start in the middle and go to the edge. There are two of them in this picture. There's the radius over here, and there's also the radius over here. So in order to name a radius, we have two options. We could say one of our radii is CE, or we could also call that EC. Another option would be to say CD is a radius, or we could call that DC. So there's two different options for radii. Both of them start in the middle. We could just go that way or that way to name the radius. Finally, what if I ask you to name the center of the circle? The center of the circle is just this point that's right here in the middle. So to name the center, I would just say C is the center. Now, there's a few more new vocab words that we need to know, and they have to do with arcs. Arcs are just pieces of the outline of a circle. A minor arc is going to be an arc that is less than half the circle. So a minor arc basically means less than half. There are lots of minor arcs in this picture. Here's one example, is the arc that goes from D to A. To name that arc, I would just write DA and draw a little arc symbol over the top. I could also name AD and draw a little arc symbol over the top. Now, that's not the only minor arc in this picture. I could also say that AB is a minor arc, and I could name that either AB or I could name it BA. Another minor arc in this picture would be the arc that goes from C to D, and I could name that either arc CD or arc DC. There's also another minor arc in this picture. Oh my gosh, there are so many. I could name BC is less than half the circle. So I could name that BC or I could also name that CB. And the last thing is, there's actually one more minor arc. I know this seems like a lot, but there's so many here. The last minor arc that I could name would start from C and go all the way to A. It's still less than half the circle. If I wanted to name that arc, I would name CA or AC. The next vocab word is major arc. Now, there's actually a typo here on this paper, so if you could please change this word to major arc. A major arc is an arc that is more than half the circle. So it's got to go more than halfway around this circle for it to count as a major arc. Now, the thing about major arcs is that there's a different way we have to name them. I'm writing the wrong word because I'm trying to talk and say different things at the same time. I apologize. It is more than half the circle. The thing about a major arc is since we want to go more than halfway around the circle, we have to be really careful how we name them. Let me show you a major arc. So one major arc would be the arc that starts at D and goes all the way around past B to C. That's called a major arc because it goes more than halfway around the circle. Now, if I just named that arc DC, I wouldn't know whether I meant this small little arc or the big major arc. So in order to show that we mean the big major arc, we name this using 3 letters. This arc starts at D, it goes towards A, and it stops at C. Now, we could also say it starts at D and it goes towards B and it stops at C. And we could also say it starts at C, it goes towards A, and it stops at D. And we could also say it starts at C and it goes towards B and it stops at D. Any of those names are okay names. You'll notice that the beginning and the ending letters are always D and C. And there's one letter in the middle, one of the other letters that's in between D and C that tells me which direction I'm going in. So don't take the short way, take the long way. Next, if I wanted to name another major arc in this picture, another example of a major arc in this picture would be the arc that starts at A, goes towards B, and keeps going all the way around to C. So to name that arc, I could name that A, B, C, or I could also name that C, B, A. Another example of a major arc in this picture would be B, C, A. Keep going all the way around. So I could name that one BCA or ACB, or I could call it BDA or ADB. You'll notice A and B are both the beginning and the ending letters, and we're just picking any other letter from in between. There are lots more major arcs in this picture. I'm going to show you just one more that we could name. We could name the one that starts from C and goes all the way around to B. If we wanted to name that major arc, we could call it lots of different names. An example would be CDB, or we could reverse that and call it BDC. We could also call it CAB, and we could reverse that and call it BAC. You kind of hopefully get the idea that we can name these arcs lots of different ways. It's just this has got to be one that's bigger than halfway around the circle. The last new vocab word of today is what's called a semicircle. Now, a semicircle is an arc that is exactly half the circle. In this picture, there are only 2 semicircles. There's the semicircle here, that's sort of the top half of the circle, and there's the semicircle here, that's sort of the bottom half of the circle. Now, if we just named these semicircles by their endpoints, they would both be DB, but we wouldn't know whether we meant the top half or the bottom half, so we have to include a middle letter here. And so my answer would be that the top semicircle would be DAB. We could also call that BAD and reverse the order of the letters. And the bottom semicircle would be DCB, and we could reverse that and call it BCD as well. All right, that is it for our vocab for this new beginning of the chapter. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you soon for some practice.